Welcome to Bad News, the media criticism show the right and the left both deserve. I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Emily Jashinsky.
Well, in today's program, we'll be talking about three of our favorite people, going from maybe least favorite to most, actually, in reality. Hunter Biden, Rashida Tlaib, actually, maybe flip those. Rashida Tlaib might be the least likable of the three. Hunter Biden, Rashida Tlaib, and Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, where we will loop back to that conversation that we had about 60 Minutes, just shameful and pathetic display. So with that, let's start with segment one on Hunter Biden.
Absolutely. Ben, I have this fantastic screenshot here from Chris Hayes, who is a host on MSNBC, who tweeted, did we ever find out the actual deal with the Hunter laptop? I mean, maybe the wildly improbably story about it was true, or maybe it was a cover story for a hack, but do we know? Ben, what did you think when that came across your screen? I was just like, bro, where have you been for 6 months?
So the question is this genuine ignorance, hackery? Hard to tell. Also, an indictment of his friends in the corporate media who have not covered this story or asked Hunter Biden any of the pertinent questions associated with the laptop. Basically, they've said, so what's the deal with the laptop, Hunter? And he said, well, it could be anything. It might be real. It could be the Russians, going back to the Russia, the favorite excuse given, which our intelligence community, former senior intelligence community members helped kind of run that information operation as well to try to make it a non-story in the first place. Chris, it's kind of all out there that dozens upon dozens of these emails have been authenticated. People on the emails have said they are credible emails. The emails show sketchy business dealings with foreign individuals and entities that got on the radar of law enforcement, the U.S. Senate, and beyond. Where were you, Chris? What have you been doing this entire time? And it's sort of like, oh, if we didn't see it, then it didn't happen. It is almost the way that I perceive it. And I suspect we could probably find a tweet from Chris Hayes out there on Russiagate that's analogous to this one. I mean, or he'd probably say that Russiagate happened and it's real. But if he didn't, I think the next best is, what actually happened here? Did we ever find out the truth?
Right. And that's the thing. It's like, we did find out the truth. And even Hunter Biden himself, I think what prompted this tweet from Chris Hayes was the CBS interview with Hunter Biden, in which Hunter Biden himself said, yeah, sure, the laptop could belong to me. It could be Russian disinformation. It could be X, Y, and Z. I think that's what prompted this tweet from Chris Hayes. And what's interesting is that he's now sort of coming around to a story that everybody was saying. And by the way, CBS came around to the story because they asked Hunter the damn question. And so now the corporate media is sort of slowly coming around to a story that actually was actively suppressed by the corporate media working in concert with the big tech industry right before a presidential election, as though that was the responsible thing to do. And 6 months later, they're coming around to it and being like, hey, actually, this is still an open question. Well, if it was an open question before the presidential election, why did you suppress it as though it were not an open question, as though it were Russian disinformation? And I know Twitter said that its policy when they were suppressing the story was to wait until we had more information to figure out whether it was disinformation. You could literally say that with every story that comes out. You could be like, we just need to wait until the story is verified for it to become anything. And that's amazing. And so what's frustrating is that they actively suppressed the story as though it were not news, and are now at least conceding that maybe there was something there. Even if Chris Hayes isn't ready to say there was something there, it's maybe there was something there. And my question for you, Ben, would be to sort of contextualize this with the news value. So what gets lost in a lot of these conversations, especially when people do media criticism, they sometimes lose track of the substance of what actually makes something newsworthy. And so from our perspective, why is the Hunter Biden story, the Hunter Biden laptop story, newsworthy? It's newsworthy, of course, from a media perspective about what we're talking now. The media is utterly corrupt and suppressed a story that had news value. But then the second layer here is, what is the news value that the legacy media always should have had its eye trained on when this was going down?
Yeah, I feel like almost all of the focus was on the salacious aspects of what was on the laptop, which feeds into the narrative of this guy Hunter has been in a shambles his entire life, and he's an addict, and it ultimately becomes a sympathetic story, and then a story of redemption, which is what, as I understand it, what his biography um, acts to sort of create an information operation for, and of course to protect his father at the end of the day. And that gets to the important point, which is that it's not about Hunter Biden. This story is about Hunter Biden's dealings with adversary companies and individuals affiliated with adversary regimes. And I'm trying to be careful in my verbiage here, but obviously any company that operates in China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party answers at the end of the day to the Chinese Communist Party. And the individuals with whom Hunter was working and who transferred into his bank account, and it appears the bank accounts of other Biden family members as well, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, not to mention the much bigger quote unquote financial transactions that occurred in terms of Hunter Biden's non-existent investing acumen, but which I guess the Chinese felt he was competent enough to be worthy of putting money into him. The bottom line is this creates a raft of potential national security issues. I mean, there's the obvious issue of compromise of a foreign government of, well, would Joe Biden then do things that would accrue to the benefit of the Biden family based upon their investments and quote unquote business links? And then, of course, the big guy himself, Hunter Biden, essentially implicating his father in these, it seems, sketchy dealings, if not outright illegal dealings, and we still don't know the truth about them yet. But the way that his business was organized was all of these shell companies, essentially. We don't really know what they did. We don't really know what they were getting paid to do. And then what was Joe Biden's role, and where was Joe Biden in all of this? And Tony Bobulinski is pretty much the only person to go on record on this on major media. And of course, it was only on Fox News. No one else would touch it. So no one really wants to touch the story. And the media corruption aspect of this is a real story that implicates national security and foreign policy. And it gets to the potential compromise of the president of the United States, or at least the appearance of a conflict of interest, which itself is corrupting and undermines our institutions. And of course, Joe Biden loves to go out there and say, we're going to run a clean administration with no nepotism and the like. And already that narrative has fallen apart with any number of hirings and dealings between other entities in the Biden administration. But set all that aside, here, the standard was, we can't delve into any of these critical questions, even though the evidence is staring us right in the face and no one can disprove it. We can't dare touch this. On the other hand, every last insinuation, of course, about the Trump administration and anyone who is within 50 degrees of separation between it was run as the truth, as if it was unimpeachable, undeniable. And then only months later did the onion get peeled back and we find, oh, these bombshells were all duds and most of them were unsubstantiated and we never found out who the sources were. But it is the complete opposite side of the coin of the evidence can be staring you right in the face and they won't touch these stories and they won't dig into them when they write themselves. On the other hand, if it's their political adversaries, they will print the most salacious allegations as the truth. Of course, the Steele dossier being the biggest part of this. And the Steele dossier, I guess the media showed relative restraint in, but it was still the core of the whole Russiagate effort, which the media, of course, was all in on.
You know, disinformation, I actually wrote a story the day after the election saying that disinformation is the media's new buzzword. Like, it's the new collusion. It's their new thing. Like, they're going to use it. They're going to build it into this incredible concept that they use to shut things down left and right. And what's interesting about all of this is that they think Chris Hayes is asking these questions now that conservatives and other people were asking in October. But the corporate press and big tech treated it as though those questions were illegitimate. And what's interesting about the steps they took to suppress that story actively is that it basically implies that the readers are rubes who are too stupid to ask these questions on their own, right? Like, we need to deem whether these questions are even valuable from our perches in the media and in Silicon Valley, and then you guys can start piecing the puzzles. But if we just let you guys have information, if we just cover the story like the New York Post did, then it's, who knows what you idiots in the rest of the country are going to come up with. That's what's sort of like, at the end of the day, most, I think, irritating and troublesome about all of this is that the media really thinks it's like Brian Stelter saying that everybody needs to take a vaccine selfie. Journalists need to take their vaccine selfies and get vaccinated on air to normalize it and to make people feel comfortable. The entire premise there is that the people who are watching, their viewers, are stupid enough that they need to be treated like sheep who see Wolf Blitzer get a shot and suddenly think, wow, this must be safe. And that's, I think, it's a kind of a crazy parallel. Like, these are two very different stories, but it's a similar thing where, like, the story was suppressed because of potential disinformation. And now Chris Hayes is treating these questions all as legitimate, not because anything major happened to legitimize it. I mean, we basically know the story right now is as legitimate as it was then because we had, people in the State Department, et cetera, saying this is not Russian disinformation, like within days of the story coming out, saying that this was not Russian disinformation. There was no reason to believe that it was Russian disinformation. And here we go. He's now asking these questions. He's now treating them as legitimate. But before the election, when everybody was in this frenzy concert to suppress the story, it was suppressed. And, I think more people saw the story as a result of it being suppressed, but I think a whole lot of people probably didn't. And it was...
Yeah, and obviously the story wasn't suppressed because of Russian disinformation. The story was suppressed because it hurt their guy. It's obvious. It's so readily transparent. It's never been more blatant. And the only thing I'd add is you need to work in some kind of Wolf Blitzer going after the sheep in one of your next pieces.
Wait, that's actually really good. Well, this actually ties into what we wanted to talk about next, because something that's interesting about this, it reminds me of sort of after the Russia hoax was pretty thoroughly debunked, we would see, I think it was Chuck Todd, he was in an interview with Senator Ron Johnson, and it was clear that Chuck Todd didn't actually know a lot of things that had happened over the course of the collusion investigation. Like, there were things that he genuinely just didn't know because conservative media was covering them much more heavily than the corporate media.
Just like Leslie Stahl.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there are things that they just genuinely don't know. And we want to talk about this Rashida Tlaib story because she said no more policing. She tweeted no more policing. She's a sitting congresswoman. She's pretty, she's been feted by the corporate media. She's pretty popular on the left. She said that, and Logan Hall at the Daily Caller went through, you can see here the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, looked at their websites, and they did not cover it. And the way that I'm sort of connecting the dots there is that, like, when they don't cover this stuff, they're legitimately out of the loop. Like Chris Hayes, like, these are the people who are supposed to be up on the news and delivering the news and, like, parsing the news and cultivating the news and curating it. And, like, when they don't cover this stuff, they end up being super out of the loop on what's actually happening in the country. And this is an incompetence that's born of their total ideological bias.
Yeah, and you have to ask here, do they not know, or do they not want people to know? Do they agree with it, and thus their silence is sort of consent? Hard to know which direction to take it. And this would be such a juicy story. I mean, they could run interference for her, and they could say, well, she's not actually talking about no policing, but she's talking about redirecting the funds into community development, which is, kind of the stock answer that they give because they know that it's totally politically untenable and absurd to argue this. But, like, the questions just write themselves. Congresswoman Tlaib, would you like to give up all of your security? Should we take down the fencing around the Capitol and actually have no metal detectors either to enter the building or congressional offices? Congresswoman Tlaib, what would Detroit, Michigan look like if you completely disbanded your police department? Congresswoman Tlaib, over the last year, we've seen a massive rise in violent crime in cities across the country, large and small. To what do you attribute this? Again, the questions just write themselves. And it would be just basic journalistic practice to say, wow, this is kind of a pretty extreme and out there quote. What do you mean by this? And what are the consequences of it? And do you want to live by the standard that you're putting forth? Or do you believe that the little people have to deal with the consequences of no policing, but you still get your security and all your special privileges? Of course, they don't want to challenge her. They probably don't want to promote her as the reality because they know how broadly unpopular the views of the likes of Congresswoman Tlaib are across the country. They know that her district itself is a disaster as a consequence of the very ideology that she is putting forth. But yeah, there is that question of, does the media not know? Does it not see it? Or does it not want you to see it? Or does it agree with it? I think that's the paradigm that we have to look at this. But I'd love to get Rashida Tlaib on the record on these questions, and I'm sure she would never answer them.
I think my audio is coming in and out, but yeah, no, that's exactly right, Ben. I mean, it's like they have such little regard for what actually constitutes news value. But like that, it's interesting to me why I want to talk about this story is how it creates this like total lack of competence on their part, how their bias like actually destroys their ability to do their jobs, and they don't even really realize it. So that's one thing where it's like, you know, here you have this story, as you say, like if it bleeds, it leads, does not apply anymore. And some people really still think the corporate media operates that way, that if a story is juicy enough, they will sort of pounce on it, and they will be like licking their chops. And that is like, does not apply anymore. The maxim, if it bleeds, it leads, just simply does not apply because they're actually like incapable of seeing the sort of metaphorical blood. Like they don't see it anymore at all. So they like now don't even realize that something is bleeding. So they have no way of knowing that it should be leading, because these things just sort of like go totally over their heads, or they don't see them. Or another thing that I think happens a lot is when the right picks up on a story, and this is true, I think also of Hunter Biden, when the right picks up on a story and says, hey, this is big news, the people in the corporate press do not want to touch it because it feels dirty to touch something that conservatives are pouncing and seizing on, as they like to say. And so they also just sort of, it makes them think implicitly that something must be overhyped, or it must be wrong, or it must be Russian disinformation because the right is all over it. And so I really feel like that happens time after time. Like as soon as conservatives jump on something and notice the news value before the left does, the left doesn't want to touch it. The sort of centrist journalists, neutral journalists don't want to touch it because they have contempt and skepticism and distrust for everything that happens on the right, to the extent that if the right is touching something, they assume that it must not be real or it must be exaggerated. And that's something that's hard to quantify, but it does seem to be at work in stories like this, where you know that journalists saw conservatives jumping on this on Twitter, and then they decided like, well, this must not be a real story. I don't know. That's my theory.
I think that we need to go with everything that comes out of the corporate media is Chinese disinformation from here on in. That's the standard that I'm sticking to.
I like that. We have a video to roll here because we want to catch up with this Ron DeSantis story. I actually accidentally caught this report from 60 Minutes Live, and I just was laughing. Here's the clip.
In the mail this week, comments on our story about disparities in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccine in Palm Beach County, Florida. Viewers focused on an exchange with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at a press conference. Some viewers, including a retired newsman, applauded the story. Ron DeSantis will continue to deny, refute, call your reporting a witch hunt. I can only hope that you continue to investigate and expose the truth. But many more comments condemned our editing and reporting. Shameful, biased reporting. That is what you're guilty of. You are no longer journalists, but lobbyists and advocates. Then there was this. I've watched 60 Minutes for decades. After your biased piece on Governor DeSantis, I will only watch it one more time, just to see if you broadcast this message. I'm Sharon Alfonsi. We'll be back next week.
Of course, so Sharon Alfonsi is the reporter who did that story. She created that package. She spent months or weeks, I guess, in Florida putting together the story that turned out to be a total joke. Ben, what did you think when you saw that?
First of all, that was a cleverly written message by David, and I'm kind of surprised that 60 Minutes ran it. The first message that they put up was the greatest of all, of course. Media protecting the media, and they cherry picked their newsman, whatever his credibility, in order to say, well, you did a great job, and don't give up the fight against the authoritarian Governor DeSantis. First of all, I would say everyone should read Chris Bedford's piece on this at The Federalist. He wrote an exceptional piece that just completely eviscerated 60 Minutes and showed the kind of journalistic malfeasance, if not straight up fraud, that occurred here, and how we're being gaslit on this issue. Of course, Alfonsi shows no contrition whatsoever for the fact that she helped create a narrative that was not supported by the facts that anyone could have seen if they played the relevant portion of the 2-minute or whatever response it was from Governor DeSantis here to the allegation that there was some nefarious pay to play going on here when the facts simply do not back up the narrative. The fact that they continue to dig this hole deeper and put up this defense, I think shows, first of all, the thin-skinned nature and also the lacking in self-awareness effort of CBS 60 Minutes, or again, contempt for the viewer, that they continue to stick to this narrative and try to present themselves as being holier than thou. And they're so sanctimonious in the way that they've responded to this. And of course, one of their initial responses in writing was, we stand by our reporting, or we stand by our story. And I think that is the true message of this whole thing. They are okay propagating the narrative, even if the truth doesn't support the narrative, because the narrative is more important. That is, politics is more important than the merits here. So, I guess I give them some modicum, very small modicum of credit for putting up the couple people who attacked the reporting. But of course, they didn't deal with the substance of the attacks, which is that you were biased because you edited this video in such a way to support a narrative that simply did not exist, should not have existed, was not based in fact. Your claims were debunked. It was shameful, pathetic, and they made it seem like they uncovered some records as if they did some real dogged reporting, when of course it was in the public, it was publicly available, anyone could have found it, and there was nothing to hide because there was nothing that should have been hidden here.
Yeah. Well, so I give them zero credit because I think what they did was cherry pick a particularly, it's a great comment, but it's not one that got to, the complaint wasn't one that got to the substance. Yep. And so they cherry picked this comment that was a critique of them, a really harsh critique of them. And it sort of allows them to pass off with more legitimacy the fact that they're really listening, which is all a ruse. It's nonsense. They actually did not take seriously any of the constructive criticism of themselves, because it is all coming from this sort of a very deep ideological situation where perspective where they aren't capable. Again, this happens every week. Everything ties into each other, but it makes it so that they're incapable of actually noticing that their reporting is biased. They're no longer capable of noticing that because they're all swimming in the same ideological pond. They don't even realize, it's like fish not knowing that they're wet. They don't realize that this is ideology. And that's at the end of the day, the big problem. So I think it's nonsense that they put these comments up to, first of all, I think it's hilarious that they put the sort of compliment of themselves up there. That is just too perfect. But it's very funny to me that in showing this fair and balanced depiction of viewer reaction, they did not actually have to address the substance of the critiques against them, and they never really did. And all they did was, put the comments on air for 10 seconds, and that allows them to sort of come away with the legitimacy of saying, "Listen, we put the comments up there. We let the viewers decide for themselves. We're listening." So it legitimizes their BS reporting, and I think that's the only real reason they did it. I think it's funny that Alfonsi came out again because she, I think in an earlier era of journalism, would have been fired. Yeah. She literally spent weeks, and it's not just her. And that's the important point to make, is that's why she's out there. That's why they defended her multiple times. And it's because that report went through multiple layers of editorial oversight before it went to air. They spent weeks on that. That went through executive oversight. That's what happens for something to get on air at 60 Minutes. It's not an easy thing. It goes through a lot of different slices of bureaucracy, and they all okayed it, even though there were sort of glaringly obvious problems to somebody who's not drunk on ideology, but they're all drunk on the ideology, which is why they defended it after the fact. And that's the best way to understand this. It's not sort of some conspiratorial partisan plan or plot. It's literally just that their ideology has bred a total incompetence. And we talked about that in every single story today, and I think it explains all of them.
Yeah, last thing I'll say on this is, not only will Alfonsi probably not face any punishment for what transpired, because as you said, this was, of course, given the imprimatur of her bosses there, watch her get promoted within a couple years, within 60 minutes. Let's see. We'll keep an eye on that, because sort of just like in government, it's failing upward, because the perception of the powers that be is not that these are failures, it's that they're actually successes, because they're driving home their political narrative at the end of the day. So on that note, I did want to ask, well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you on your appearance on Gutfeld, which was fantastic, and let our viewers know when you'll next be on. Do you know when you'll next be on?
No, I don't, but it was really fun, and I love the format of that show. It's so cool. It's very like conversational, and it's a good anytime that there's an opportunity to use humor and satire, I think is particularly helpful in the world of media, because there's so much to satirize, and sometimes the best way to critique the press is with satire, because it's so unbelievable and so ridiculous that you can't even really talk about it with a straight face.
Yeah, and I would say, first of all, and this is one of the things that makes Gutfeld a one-of-a-kind figure on the conservative side, but also the fact that that show exists and that Fox felt that there was a demand for it and an audience for it, I think is itself a critique of the media, which is to say that there's been a massive gaping hole in terms of late night TV that isn't just leftist propaganda. And Gutfeld proved that with Red Eye, but I'm really glad to see and well deserved that he has this position. And I hope he has you on all the time.
It's a really good point about a media blind. I wrote a long story about the media's blind spot when it comes to shows like this a year or two ago, and it's very, very true. That's why Gutfeld gets great ratings. It's that there is this market for what what they're not doing, and again, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's good, it'll rise to the top. It's just not the case in the corporate media anymore, because they are so ideological. And as we're wrapping up, maybe this is a topic for another show, but I just want to address this comment. Oh, they know, don't buy the fish in the water analogy. I'm telling you, as somebody who spends a lot of time with these people, they actually really, really don't. They really genuinely don't see themselves as partisans. They don't even understand that certain things, like certain cultural inclinations that they have, where they believe, in a very radical concept of sex and gender. They have no idea that has partisan implications. They have no idea that actually constitutes ideology anymore. They literally just think that's decency. So they've conflated their ideology with decency to the point where it's their cultural ideology, to the point where they no longer recognize it as ideological. And to that point, they actually don't see then that there are these very partisan implications that are downstream of it. We talk about this all the time on the show, but I insist that is completely the case. They're actually proud to not have partisan affiliations, but they don't understand their sort of ideological affiliation. So do you have anything to add on that point, Ben? Maybe we can do a whole show on that at some point.
Yeah, we should focus on that. They don't know what they don't know. They look at us like we're, through anthropological eyes, like we are some weird species, when, again, they are the radical minority and we're kind of the middle of the country, common sense sort of Americans. So, yeah, we should definitely do an episode on that. It's sort of, that theme sort of pervades every episode we do in reality every week here. And I hope everyone will tune in and join us again on Friday, where we wrap up the week and drive you to drink before happy hour with some more horrible stories. So with that, this has been Bad News, the media criticism show the right and the left also deserve. I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And we'll see you on Friday.